Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. When Trump was elected, we knew we were in for some kind of miserable set of outcomes within the federal government. And sure enough, the carnage there has been staggering, nowhere more so than at the Department of Justice, where the wreckage runs deep. Even under the best conditions, restoring its integrity will be a long and arduous process. But the alarming surprise of the second month has been Trump's outlandish assertions of leverage over powerful sectors of civil society, including big law, big media, and the academy. And we've learned, to our chagrin, that even the biggest and richest players in the country can be brought to their knees by Trump's threats. And, as always with Trump, these mafia-style strong-arm tactics have absolutely zero foundation in legitimate executive power, but are nakedly part of his endless personal reprisal campaign. It's the same dynamic that prompted both of his impeachments, but now these schemes pass by in real time, quickly replaced by the next outrage. To dig into a week in which Trump's tyrannical ambitions have never been more in the open, but in which the courts continue to hand him a series of defeats, we welcome three of the country's best-known and most trenchant columnists. And they are Emily Bazelon, a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine, co-host of the popular and excellent podcast, The Slate Political Gabfest, and a lecturer and Truman Capote Fellow at Yale Law School. Before coming to the Times, Bazelon was a senior editor at Slate, where she co-founded the women's section XX. Emily, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker and a host of the Political Scene podcast. She previously served as editor of several Washington-based publications. She's written several books, including The Divider with Peter Baker, which we covered in a Talking Books episode. Pleasure to see you as always, Susan.
Yeah, great to be with you again, Harry. Thank you.
And Carol Leonnig, a Washington Post investigative reporter and MSNBC contributor. She's a 4. Some people just are totally gluttonous. 4-time Pulitzer Prize winner and a 3-time winner of the George Polk Award for Investigative Reporting, and the author of 3 best-selling books, Zero Fail, A Very Stable Genius, and I Alone Can Fix It, with co-author Phil Rucker, which we also covered in a previous Talking Books episode. Carol, thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be joining this illustrious group.
And speaking of which, we 4 last convened a little over a year ago in a completely different world. So in the last couple months, Trump and Musk have taken a sledgehammer to the federal government, indiscriminately hacking away at whole agencies and governmental functions and asserting measures of executive power, including unchecked power, wildly in excess of anything the country has ever experienced. So we talked about that a year ago, at least as a sort of paranoid fantasy, but I don't think, at least I did not grasp the prospects for the sort of cowing and bullying of big sectors of civil society, including law, media, tech, big business, and we're now seeing him extend his tentacles into those areas with the same reprisal agenda and some pretty damn impressive and unsettling results. So we could start almost anywhere, but let's look first at the stunning, I want to say, capitulation to Trump pressure of one of the biggest and most prominent law firms in the country, Paul Weiss. So on Thursday, yesterday, we tape on Friday, Trump rescinded an executive order targeting Paul Weiss after the firm pledged to review its hiring practices, to provide $40 million in legal services for certain White House initiatives. The move follows what must have been a bizarre meeting between Trump and Brad Karp, the chairman of the law firm and someone that the legal world takes to be a, Goliath above any kind of government pressure. Not so. What do you think happened during the meeting? Why did Paul Weiss knuckle under? And, more broadly, what the hell?
I found this to be one of the most unsettling things that I've seen happen to date. And I think, along with Susan, Emily, and you, Harry, have been unsettled by a lot of things, right? The delivered promise to get rid of every single prosecutor who was involved in doing their jobs and investigating evidence of crime, the promise delivered by Donald Trump to frighten the bejesus out of anybody who had a piece of the largest criminal investigation in the Department of Justice's history. The unsettling thing about Paul Weiss agreeing to this is just so stunning that a law firm, one which, after 9/11, many law firms proudly said, sorry, we are law firms. We are going to provide legal services to people who are accused in the plot to take down the towers and ruin our country in 9/11. That is our job as lawyers. This is a firm now saying, essentially, well, I guess we're going to have to pay the piper, the person who is making these dramatic threats, and we don't know whether or not he can deliver on them. That is like the through line that I think of in all the topics you've raised with us, Harry. It's like everyone appears to be so afraid of what he'll get away with, essentially, and whether or not it will affect their businesses.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you told me a year ago that Trump, when he came back, was going to undertake a campaign of revenge and retribution against people he perceived as his political enemies or his enemies inside the deep state, I would not have been surprised because he told us that he was going to do it, guys. So part of the problem is the failure of those who claim to stand against Trump is their failure of imagination to take him seriously enough, I think, to have a viable plan to oppose him. And so I think that's a part of the calculation here. How is it that 8 weeks in, we're still surprised that he's undertaking a campaign of revenge and retribution that has sort of taken on maximalist character? So I think that is important to say. Now, where I think we all would have been surprised, or at least, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but for me, absolutely, the broad front on which he's undertaking it, I think, is a little bit of, and the aggressiveness. We're only 8 weeks in to the Trump administration. So, did I envision there would be a series of specific executive orders targeting law firms? In the case of Paul Weiss, since we're talking about that, he was actually going after the firm because of the work that he didn't like of a lawyer who doesn't even work there anymore. And so the idea that the firm would cave in on this particular thing seems even more remarkable because it shows that Trump, even seizing upon the thinnest of pretexts, is able to achieve extraordinary concessions from people. And by the way, you see this with the media as well. Would it surprise any of us that Trump is going after the media? No. This is a man who has vilified independent journalism from the get-go, called us enemies of the people, did target individual outlets and reporters at times in his first term in office. Not a surprise. The fact that he filed a lawsuit, for example, that has to do with an interview, not even of himself, but of his opponent, Kamala Harris, and he didn't like the editing of it from the 2024 campaign, and that lawsuit would not have been laughed out of court already by a judge. That is a bit surprising. And then
it would have been laughed out of court until he became president, right? And then it's not the court that endorsed it, but the corporate parents of CBS.
Well, except that, I think there's judges involved here too at this point. There have been cases that have been allowed to proceed that Trump has brought against media organizations that my previous understanding, and again, you guys are the lawyers here, but it's remarkable how many times judges have allowed Donald Trump to get away with lawsuits that seem crazy on their face. But then just the third point I wanted to make, because I think this is really important to our broader conversation, what would we have been surprised by a year ago is definitely, I don't think it's the revenge campaign. I think it's the wholesale attack in this way on the federal government with Elon Musk at the helm and the willingness to essentially just crash right through and even advance absurd or not plausible arguments for the legality of what they're doing. Just eliminate agencies not even bother to go through Congress. They're not even trying to give the veneer or the patina of legality to many of the actions, extreme aggressive actions that seem designed to create radical new facts on the ground, and then let the legal chips where they fall where they may afterwards. That seems to me to be the thing that I certainly did not have a full understanding that was going to be what they were going to do. Because my guess is they themselves, the Musk role in all this actually grew after the election. But I'll leave it there.
I mean, I think to go back to Paul Weiss, there are two things that I find very unsettling about this. One is that one of the hopeful aspects of America that separates us from countries like Russia and Hungary that have a slide toward autocracy is we have an incredibly vibrant and strong civil society. We have very strong universities. We have a huge network of other kinds of organizations. And law firms are for-profit entities, but because of the ethics that lawyers abide by, I consider them part of that civil society. And what we're seeing is capitulation and a kind of very fast weakening of those institutions. And I think the reason for that is, first of all, the federal government is incredibly powerful, and having the ability to make threats, which are about taking funding away or taking contracts or access away, those are like really serious swords of Damocles to hang over people's heads. The second thing is Trump is brilliant at going after people, or in this case, companies or universities, one by one. And so everybody has their turn walking the gangplank. And the people who are not yet at risk, their sort of rational calculation is to sit back and wait and hope that they escape. But every single time, it means that it emboldens the president, because the weakness of the one person caving makes it harder for everybody else to stand up the next time. And it's just the classic tactic of a bully. Like, that's right. I mean, I sort of feel like Trump learned how to do this in prep school. And it's amazing how well it works for him.
Yeah. I mean, there is a collective action problem. There's all this federal funding and stuff to Paul Weiss, but that's not what's going on. The panicky, sweating partners in the conference room are saying, will big clients engage us when they know we're persona non grata with Trump and with the administration? And indeed, even you think about Perkins Coie that has fought back in the courts. A lot of people think even so they're not going to survive. So they win in the courts, and the conservative clients and general counsels of companies still think, well, we can go to Perkins Coie, or we can, do we want to do that? And then the second thing I just want to point out is, yeah, it's a reprisal campaign for sure. But I mean, there's not, the reprisals are just of him personally. There's not the slightest pretense, but the way he does it, and this is a technique or trope that is cross-cutting, each of those three orders cite the national security, meaning shut up, I get to do this, and come on. He actually makes findings that because of these things that these law firms have done, it's an actual risk to national security. So we're seeing this. We're also seeing this, and we'll talk in a moment about the Boasberg case, but just the thinking that he can take that slogan and just proffer it around and do whatever the F he wants, that as a legal point, something's going to have to give.
Two quick responses to Emily's very important points. Number one, on civil society and how this resembles some of the attacks on democracy you've seen in other countries that have had essentially a move toward an illiberal system. Speaking recently with a friend of ours from Russia, and we were there in the first 4 years of Putin's tenure, which was essentially the period of the rollback of democracy, kind of a foundational moment of Putin's tenure. And, it was a systematic going after civil society, that's independent journalism, to the extent it existed, targeting individual business people and oligarchs in Russia as in the United States. Frankly, the wealthier the people, the more quickly they crumbled. And we're seeing that here in the US as well. But, really sadly, speaking with one friend of ours who is a Russian journalist that we've known for a quarter century, who no longer is able to go back to Russia because of the war in Ukraine, who said the only thing that really surprised her at this moment in time was that the Americans, frankly, were crumbling more quickly, and that at least Putin had to put Russia's richest man in jail and, kill some of his critics like Anna Politkovskaya for Russian civil society to get the message and back off. And it's the cravenness and weakness of our civil society that really leapt out to her. And I think that's important because it's not just the law firms. And, part of the thing about the Paul Weiss executive order was that it came after there were already 2 previous executive orders targeting by name individual law firms in a way that I don't recall ever seeing anything like this from any presidential administration in American history. And yet it's the failure to have stood up when he started to do it, when he broke the norm. And that leads the way to the leadership of Paul Weiss saying there's no one to come and help us because we've already proven that point. We've already seen this happen with journalists. And I will tell you, I don't know what the future looks like, but I feel very confident looking at history and precedent to say that when the White House press corps and the leadership of Americans' news organizations failed to stand up for the Associated Press, that if somebody's still around to write an independent history of this period of time in Washington, that was the original sin. Forget about what's going to happen next. When Donald Trump throws the Associated Press, the backbone of American journalism in small towns and red America and all around the world, and he throws them out purely on free speech grounds. He says, you don't want to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America as I, have clicked my heels and ordered you to do. That's the only rationale given. And where the hell were our leaders of these news organizations? So I think all that comes afterwards in the targeting of independent voices, it's because nobody said a goddamn thing.
I don't disagree with you that there could have been a more full-throated, but I think a lot of people, they were kind of catching their breath and then came forward and said, wait a minute, what about the Associated Press?
Carol, what did they do? I'm sorry, but they practically tripped over each other to take the Associated Press's seat in the White House press pool, okay? There was nothing principled, like a couple individual people putting out tweets, like mealy-mouthed statements 10 days later from the main alleged journalism organizations. That is humiliating. And believe me, that is not how the news societies who were independent reacted in Russia and Hungary. Honestly, we have shamed ourselves. And I respect your right to have a disagreement, but I feel like it was one of the most shameful things I've ever seen.
You raise a really good point about not just about the press, but about the whole issue of Andrew Weissman has mentioned this a couple of times, but the NATO approach, right? Why didn't the law firms all gather hands when Covington was first identified? What is Covington's big problem? They have a lawyer there who is a close colleague of Jack Smith's and offered him legal counsel appropriately and prophylactically because the presidential candidate and frontrunner for office was promising to come after him. So, I mean, that was an important moment for people to gather hands. And I take your point. You and I will have very little disagreement, Susan, maybe on the fringes and the margins and the degree to which people should have spoken up for the Associated Press. But I think you've highlighted something important about the lack of gathering hands. I'm not an advocate. I'm a reporter. I watch what's happening. And I was talking to a source the day that the then acting Deputy Attorney General, Emily Bazelon, had commandeered a group of public integrity prosecutors into a room and essentially pointed a gun at their heads. I mean, not a real gun, but the effect of a gun, and said, you will sign this motion to dismiss charges against a person we have ample evidence of corruption running the city of New York and taking foreign bribes. You will sign this or you will all be fired. And a source said to me that day, they should have all walked out. They should have all joined hands and left. And it's easy for me to hear that source say that because I know people's life insurance and health insurance and their mortgages are on the line. But when you don't have Covington, Paul Weiss, Gibson Dunn joining hands, it's another matter.
Yeah, and by the way, of those 30 people in the room, 24 have been fired already anyway. The lesson is also there's nothing you can do that will satisfy Trump, is that you capitulate and the next demand is forthcoming. To Emily's point, maybe we can close out this one and move to another aspect, but first they came for Covington. First they came for AP. First they came for public integrity. First they came for CBS.
Columbia University.
Columbia University. At first they came for the Washington Post. You guys, all three of you, have an exceptionally sort of glum view that the moment for collective action has passed. So do you see this now as a fait accompli on the ground? There's no chance that the big law firms, who I know are discussing it, band together and do exactly what should have been done right away. We're in this all together, Mr. President. You got to come after all of us.
I don't think it's a fait accompli. I mean, I am worried that what you just said won't happen, but I think that absolutely these are still choices that are available to the institutions.
He's sure not done, right? With law firms.
Right. And I mean, how many times do people need to watch this dynamic of the bully picking people off or institutions off one by one to realize that it continues? I think the problem is, like, there are a lot of law firms, there are a lot of universities. And so it is true that most of them will probably not be targeted in this way. And so then there is this incentive to duck. But the damage to the sort of collective is very real, and that's the collective action problem you were talking about earlier, Harry.
It's never too late to do the right thing. And I think that the lesson in all these places is that. I also think that, Trump and Elon Musk and those who are enabling them in the legal sphere benefit from their opponents' unwillingness to believe the unpalatable truth. And there's a weakness in our legal system that Donald Trump exploited to win election to office again. And he ran out the clock and he tied up things in litigation, and he benefited from his own previous reshaping of many of our federal courts. And he wins even by losing some of these cases at this point. And so the failure to oppose Trump is also the failure of his opponents to learn the lesson that Trump himself has taught them. And I find that remarkable. We're talking about 1 4-year term that this man has been elected to at this point. While we still have a system left, you would think that his opponents would have learned to fight, because at a minimum, you run out the clock and you delay him from doing something more radical. You mentioned campaign Trump talked about a lot of things, but would he really follow through with it? Remember, we're 8 weeks in only. So we've only seen the tip of the spear here. They haven't had time to launch prosecutions of his opponents. They're just getting up to speed in the Justice Department. Well, how, now, because you failed in many respects, big law has failed. He's already politicized and divided the lawyers. He's already suggested that it's somehow a crime in this country for law firms to represent people that he doesn't like. Well, they're going to need representation too, because if Trump does what we expect him to do and starts to prosecute his opponents, which again, he hasn't done yet, or misuse the FBI, which again, they haven't had a chance to, kick into gear yet. Well, then does that mean that his early attacks on the system and the idea that these law firms should even represent people, what's going to happen to those people when he starts trying to put them into jail?
No shit. And by the way, this reflects my DOJ bias, but as Carol saw the Paul Weiss thing as the most mind-bending, his speech at the Department of Justice and Bondi's introduction of him and all it portended, just sent steam out of my ears. And it's funny, one of the things that are happening is he's moving so quickly that seems like, remember those pardons of the January 6th offenders? It's like a decade ago. All right, let's move to another area it's the same. First they came for, as Emily says, Columbia University. And I want to lay this out. There's also a little kind of wrinkle there that I was hoping to get your views on. So he signed an executive order to begin dismantling the U.S. Department of Education. He actually expressed ambivalence and took the time to praise those employees and teachers, etc. And this is a has been an agenda item for 30 plus years in the Republican Party. Why are they doing it? Why? What do they hope to gain from gutting the Department of Education itself? And is this just the old version of it? Or is there some new MAGA angle here? Leaving aside that, yes, they can't do it legally. It's Congress's job. But what's going on?
The talking points on this, I'm no expert on the Department of Education, but I'm an expert in watching what Trump says and does outside and what his department says or what his lawyers now, the president's lawyers now say in court. And there's a discrepancy between the two. Yeah, I'm sorry. Back to your DOJ speech in the Great Hall, forgive me. But the rhetoric is what's important. It seems to me what's most valuable to the Trump administration to make a claim that now when we get rid of this department, you in the local communities are going to have control of your schools again. They're not going to be trying to convince your kids to go trans. They're not going to try to influence your children into considering whether they might be gay. They're not going to change, your librarian's decisions about what are safe books for kids to read. And that's all baloney. Local counties, largely, along with states, are the ones funding schools. And so it's a great talking point that doesn't relate to what the Department of Education does. And indeed, Trump is now sort of, it seems to me, I'm looking at it a little bit on the outside, it seems to me he's now learning that actually one of the most important parts of the Department of Education has to do with these student loans and with these large block grants for kids with disabilities and huge amounts of funds that are for kids that are in lower income neighborhoods. And now he's like, okay, maybe we won't get rid of it. Maybe we'll move these other pots of money somewhere else because it turns out some of those are actually important.
Also, Congress authorized all those funds. I mean, just to state the obvious. I kind of feel like this war on the Department of Education, as you were implying, Harry, is sort of an anachronism. I mean, right? This was like a goal going back to the Reagan administration, and it's still on the table. And yes, Carol, I think you're right about this caricature of what the Department of Ed does. But, an important part of what it does is try to enforce laws that protect kids who need special education in some way. And I think a lot of those parents are really worried for good reason about what's going to come next. And I just really wonder, what is this going to look like on the ground? Those are really important sets of funding that you were talking about. And it's really unclear how they're going to be administered.
Although, again, I think the point here is the destruction. And this is not, unfortunately, the asymmetry in the conversation. We're still approaching it to a certain extent in a technocratic sense. Oh my, what's going to happen to these programs and policies? And I think that, that's part of the success here. I call this the kind of technocrats versus Godzilla problem. And I actually think it's one that to a certain extent, even somewhat predates Trump, but certainly has been the major dynamic that I've observed at a high altitude level since the beginning of the Trump era, is that you have, whether it was the Obama administration, the Biden administration, the Democratic Party more broadly, essentially identifying as the party of responsible governance, at least in this era in our politics. And doesn't mean that they always achieve that. But, they're having these very, remember the Obama era kind of like behavioral economics, right? It's like, how do we nudge people? How do we, as if government is a sort of rational entity and we're just kind of twisting the dials one way or the other. And sometimes maybe it's a little bit more here and sometimes it, goes over here depending on the results of elections. And then you have the sort of Steve Bannon, Donald Trump wrecking ball approach. And they found this incredibly potent new instrument in Elon Musk and the advent of AI government. And I just think those are non-intersecting conversations. We don't know exactly what we don't know in terms of what this process looks like inside the very opaque process of the Trump administration, despite their claims to being so open, because Donald Trump, comes out to the cameras every day and spews verbal diarrhea. There is the opposite of transparent when it comes to what's actually happening that's leading to these enormous changes in our government. And so when you go to Harry's question about the education department, okay, it's a longstanding ideological goal going back to the Reagan administration, Emily, but it doesn't mean that they had an off-the-shelf plan. It doesn't mean that they have a competent team overseeing it. It doesn't mean that they know even today, even after Trump has signed an executive order in a big glitzy ceremony at the White House, as he did on Thursday afternoon to move to dismantle this, I don't think they really have a plan. And that tells you everything, and yet, by the way, my fear with almost everything we're talking about today is that they still see and are probably correct that there's political advantage there, that these are calculated assaults on the institution, on the system, the things that we here in Washington care about, the things that lawyers care about, but that the rule of law or, due process are abstractions to many Americans, and that deporting violent, murderous, killer gangbangers, as Donald Trump has called these people, absolutely rates more highly for many Americans, including many Democrats, than the principles that Judge Boasberg is asking about. Same thing with the Department of Education. Why shouldn't individual school systems have more money for their students? And, who needs these damn unelected bureaucrats in Washington?
Yeah, they actually like this fight. Here's another really important asymmetry, and I think it's cross-cutting, including the people who've been let go at DOJ, et cetera. It's almost like, the second law of thermodynamics, if I can be pointy-headed. Easy to bust things up, really hard to put them back together. And I mean, we are already past the point in several places. DOJ is one of them, where if they just sort of went away magically tomorrow, the mess of and the reconstitution of the culture and the missions of these different places that have been left in chaos would be the work of, I don't know, months, years, more. Certainly when you think about the Department of Justice, this really long-standing, rock-solid set of cultural norms, they're just been obliterated. And it's not the sort of thing that you can just show up and say, oh, now we're back to the old plan. It's a cultural deal. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we stir up a discussion around cocktails. Make your own or buy them ready to drink. There's no question that mixing a delicious cocktail is truly an art form. Precise measurements and proportions, creative substitutions, the presentation itself, and even the speed of delivery are all factors that earn great mixologists the reputations they deserve. But for people who may not stock things like triple sec and bitters, a ready-to-drink cocktail that's pre-measured and mixed just might be worth pulling off the shelf. Ready-to-drink cocktails don't necessarily give you the satisfaction of creating a drink from scratch, but they do offer up undeniable convenience, removing the complexity of recipes, the burden of acquiring ingredients, and the time it takes to measure, pour, mix, crush, stir, and of course, repeat. Plus, you still have the ability to customize your drink, adding a splash of this or that, here or there, to your liking. So, whether you're into customization or convenience, ready-to-drink cocktails give you a little bit of both. Now, who says you can't have your cocktail and drink it too? So what's better, customization or convenience? Probably depends on the situation. It can be fun crafting your own cocktail, but when time is short, ready-to-drink cocktail sure does hit the spot. Either way, you can grab all the ingredients you need for a great craft cocktail, or get your ready-to-go favorite at Total Wine & More.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. All right, let's talk about the possible Paul Weiss figure, and you mentioned it, Emily, Columbia University. Again, you would think an institution that's beyond the influence of a tyrannical president, but he basically said, I'm taking $400 million from you unless we start talking, and there's some things I kind of want. We're going to find out today. I mean, It was a ransom note, right? Do this or forfeit $400 million. They've got to be in there bonding about this small Middle Eastern studies department. The word on the street, and I defer to Carol, who's the in her reportorial skills, but is that they're going to cave, or they're going to enter into this discussion in the same way. And other universities, just as we talked about there, are kind of keeping their heads down. It could be bad. You have some really important voices. David Graham saying this would be a disaster for Columbia, for American higher education, and for the United States. Chris Eisgruber, the president of Princeton, really good article in the Atlantic, just setting out the incredible bounty to the United States of the marriage of the federal government and research institutions who nevertheless had academic freedom, and what it's meant for development of technology, attraction of the best and brightest to the United States, all kinds of things.
I think what is tough about this one, and a lot of the moves Trump has made, is that I did a lot of reporting at Columbia last spring. Columbia made some mistakes in handling the protests, I would argue. And I think that there were some anti-Semitic incidents that were not addressed immediately. And then, of course, there was the overreaction in the other direction of calling the NYPD, the New York City Police Department, down on the student protesters, which I think also backfired on the school. So the school is vulnerable, but the idea that a correct remedy is to threaten it with losing $400 million in research funds that were mostly to science and medicine just seems like,
with $5 billion as the real sword of Damocles in the background, right?
And I think that's important because if it was a $400 million penalty, then I think Columbia could really think about, and I would hope would think seriously about using some of its endowment to deal with this imbalance. But of course, they assume that if they try to stand up to the federal government, then they're at risk of losing much more. I will say, I think this order is illegal, right? I mean, there was no hearing, there was no process. The schools should have a chance to be able to correct the problem. The penalties have to be related to the actual problem, not about science and medicine. If your concern is the Middle Eastern and Africa department and other allegations, so all of that is the sort of context for saying that the school's in a really difficult position, but these principles of academic freedom are absolutely core to its mission. The idea that you're going to take a department and in some way threaten its existence because the federal government told you to do that, I mean, that's just I'm married to an academic, and that is really not the way it's supposed to work. And it's going to break something fundamental about the school. And we already have a threat against a second institution, which the Trump administration is saying they're going to freeze $175 million from the University of Pennsylvania. So, the sort of same pattern we were talking about with the law schools is already occurring. And then you just really worry about the damage to these schools, which have these principles that they have said are more important than anything else.
I mean, hats off to Georgetown, right?
You mean Bill Traynor?
Yes. Who basically said, sorry, we know how to run our institution. Not sure what you mean exactly by telling us we need to get rid of DEI. What does that even mean? What are we supposed to just scrub the words diversity and equity and inclusion? Are we, as Elon Musk attempts to do with his fairly dramatic AI tools? I'm glad that some institutions are saying hands off, because they are an important independent institution, as the Department of Justice should be. But I do have a thought that I just want to share, which just kind of rips me to the core as a person who's watching one of the best and brightest child oncology researchers in the country, who had some great experiences with research that was showing that a kind of immunology was better than another treatment for saving children from pediatric cancers. And they were so successful in this research that they basically stopped the research so they could move all of the kids to the life-saving treatment. Her work has been frozen. And, mark my words, kids are going to die because we are not going to allow that work to proceed while we have this battle with academic institutions and scientific research. The two things are really scary about how far we'll fall behind, and what will these smart people who do this cutting edge research do in the interim, and who will pay with their lives?
And the contrast between the pettiness of what he's doing and the consequences, Susan, you probably saw the interview between David Remnick and Atul Gawande on USA. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to die for the, yes, lawless, but also petty, megalomaniacal inanity of this brute.
Well, look, first of all, the USAID example shows that it's about using leverage. It's about wreckage. It's not about budget cutting. USAID is a good example. It's less than 1% of the federal budget. Certainly Americans, whatever their political persuasion, it's hard to imagine that a significant percentage of them believed that they were voting for Donald Trump to eliminate cancer researchers or to go to war with Canada for that matter. And, it all sounds sort of unbelievable, but that's the thing about somebody who's really making a power grab like this. The more unbelievable that you can get people to go along with, of course, the more power that you acquire. And Trump or someone around him has identified an extraordinary amount of leverage over these institutions and an extraordinary weakness of leadership in them. And, I think going back to Emily's reporting last year during the post October 7th crisis on some of the campuses like Columbia, what did you see in those congressional hearings? What are you seeing now? You're seeing a failure of leadership. And that was a weakness that some of Trump's allies on Capitol Hill identified and successfully exploited to their own personal political gain in 2024. But I think it also has helped to inform this strategy. In my view, the thing that links together this conversation across a variety of fronts is the weakness of leadership in those institutions that we have that are, the only way to stand up to somebody making disruptive power grabs. And it doesn't mean that everyone is weak. It doesn't mean, that they cave across the board. But Trump's great skill is in many ways in identifying the fault lines, the pressure points, turning things that weren't previously contentious or partisan into divisions. That's why we called our book about him the divider. You're seeing what he's done. He divided the Republican Party against itself and then took over the Republican Party in his first term and his first campaign. Now he's employing those techniques against other parts of our society, and he's watching them crumble, whether it's finding a law firm that doesn't do what we think it's going to do, or a university president, that's willing to cave in. Why aren't they filing lawsuits against something that's so illegal? Even if they ultimately lose, again, tie it up, establish the principle, stop them before they kill again.
And by the way, Paul Weiss is going to get hurt badly. Who's going to come to them from having done this?
Harry, you made the point that those lawyers in the public integrity section, they're delusional. Trump's opponents across the board are delusional. If they think he's going to stop, if they think handing him a victory means that that's enough for him, that's not how this game works. And those people lost their jobs anyways, but they lost it along with a little bit of their remaining integrity. And when you look at Columbia and you look at these Ivy League...
And what about the rest of the universities in the country? Where are they here?
They suffer as a result of the weakness of those who are tested first.
Susan, you and Emily together, you have two thoughts that are so important to tie together. You say, okay, Trump's a genius at finding the fault lines, and look at this weak leadership in a ton of institutions we've already gone through. And Emily, you said almost like a sweet little aside, and by the way, I think this is illegal. Well, that is what is so amazing about the velocity of the Stephen Miller, largely Stephen Miller and also Steve Bannon planning, is the velocity of the illegality is almost too much for the institutions to on board and then decide, okay, sure, we'll sue, and then so-and-so will sue, and so-and-so will sue. But do you see how many lawsuits there already are that are in in the middle of pleadings or debates, and meanwhile the damage is being done, right? The winner here is definitely the defendant, not the plaintiff.
Including even if they lose. Man, do I hate to do this, but I have to blow my moderator's whistle because we're about out of time. I wish we could go for hours or come back next week, but I hope at least it won't be a year. Lots happening out there. We just have time for Talking Five, our final feature, which this week is the administration apparently added a few terms to its agreement with Paul Weiss after the firm capitulated. What is the next teeny little requirement it will impose unilaterally?
Total guess, drop another client I don't like or another 10.
Now wear a MAGA hat.
That's a good one. They caved on everything.
And I think I'm going with no more plastic straws ever. Thank you so much to Emily, Susan, and Carol, and thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Check us out on Substack at Talking Feds Substack, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, breaking down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so your support and nothing else funds all of our franchises. We are grateful. And Talking Feds has joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this new media venture, committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Rest assured, we're still the same scrappy, independent podcast you've come to know and trust, just now linked up with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's political discourse. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in. And don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producer is Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbalu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.